So, bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à ce webinaire sur la diplomatie multilatérale pour un monde post-COVID. Quel rôle pour le Canada? Welcome to this webinar on multilateral diplomacy in a post-COVID world. What role for Canada? Our speaker for today's event is Honourable Bob Rae, the current ambassador and permanent representative of Canada to the United Nations. My name is Teddy Sami, and I'm the director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, NPSIA, at Carleton University. We're delighted to host today's event. I'd like to first acknowledge that the land on which the Carleton University campus is located is on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. I warmly welcome all the students, faculty members, alumni, and community members who are in attendance today. And we look forward to your questions in the discussion ahead. Please post your questions in the Zoom Q&A, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. I should note that this event is being recorded. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Tag El-Kassin, who's a senior fellow at NPSIA. Tag is an engineer by training and has worked on various issues that include water resources, infrastructure and energy projects, conflict resolution and peace building. He's particularly interested in issues of conflict in the Horn of Africa region and has been a consultant for Oxfam, CEDA, USAID, and the World Bank, among others. I will now turn things over to you, Tag, so that you can introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Teddy. Mr. Rae served as Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995 and interim leader of the Leader Party of Canada from 2011 to 2013. He was elected to federal and provincial parliaments 11 times between 1978 and 2013. Mr. Rae received his honors BA in Modern History from the University of Toronto and Master of Philosophy in Politics as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University and graduated from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 1977. He also wrote Lessons to be Learned on the Air India Bombing and Ontario Leader in Learning. Mr. Rae's return to Parliament for the constituency of Toronto Centre in 2008 led to his appointment as Foreign Affairs spokesperson for his party and to his election as interim leader in 2011. Mr. Rae is a fellow of the Forum of Federations, an organization he co-founded in 1990. It flourished during his time as chair and president. This is when I traveled with him to Sudan and South Sudan under difficult conditions. And I had first-hand knowledge of his capabilities. He's also a great travel companion. He had a major surgery years back, and as he's a fighter, he bounced back as good as new. In October 2017, Mr. Rae was appointed as Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar. In this role, he engaged in diplomatic efforts to address crises in the country's Rakhine state and wrote a report, Tell Them We Are Human, in 2018. Bob Rae is a private councillor, a companion of the Order of Canada, a member of the Order of Ontario. In addition to several government reports, he is author of 5 books. Along with music, reading, and writing, he also loves tennis, golf, and fishing. He is married to Arlene Perley Rae, writer and public advocate on issues affecting women and children. They have 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. I hope you enjoy them all, Bob. And I wish to thank Sophie for helping us to organize this. Back to you, Teddy. Thank you.
So please go ahead, Ambassador. So I'll turn things over to you now, and then we'll, as I said, I encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A, and then we'll take the questions after your remarks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, very much for that introduction, Tag. It's good to see you again. I appreciate very much the opportunity to join you at Carleton. It's part of what I do. I just reflecting with my staff about how my time is spent, and I spend a fair bit of time talking to students and university audiences, not only in Canada, but increasingly now around the world. So it's a real pleasure to be able to engage with you and to share with you some perspectives from here in New York. The title of the lecture may be a little misleading because I think we realize that we're not really in the post-COVID world yet. We're in the middle of the COVID world. And the theme of what I wanted to really talk about is how there are a number of major forces at work today in the world which make multilateralism even more important. I think if you think about it, since 1945, we've seen periods in which the UN was very much at the center of things. We've seen other periods when that was not the case. We've seen times when Canada seemed to be more preoccupied with other issues and less so with multilateral ones. But I think that the underlying reality of our time is that there are several forces at work that make multilateralism even more important than ever. And so let me just describe as briefly as I can what I see these as being. The first one is the immediate and ongoing impact of COVID, because COVID is a pandemic that has no nationality. It is a truly global phenomenon. We've experienced the waves of it, and we are experiencing another wave of it. And different parts of the world are experiencing it differently in terms of its intensity and its impact. But the pandemic has had an extraordinary effect on the globe and on each country. In many ways, COVID has been described as a leveler. We're all in this together kind of argument. But actually, I don't think that's true. I think that COVID is much more of a revealer. I think it has revealed and accentuated certain key challenges that we face. First of all, it's revealed inequality. And global inequality has always been there. And it looked for a period of time as if there was enough growth throughout the global economy, it would be spread sufficiently that we could say that inequality is being dramatically reduced. But that's actually not happening right now. And COVID has revealed the extent to which that's not happening. It's actually magnified the inequalities of wealth, and it's magnified the inequalities of health and well-being. We know that there are significant differences around the world in terms of access to the vaccine, in terms of access to healthcare more broadly. And so COVID has been an extremely significant event in the life of the world. In many respects, it's been the most dramatic, sharp event that we've experienced since World War II, in terms of its effect on human life, but also its effect on human well-being and on the health of the global economy and of global societies. The second is, and I don't mean these in any order of priority, we can all argue about which is more serious, is climate change. For a long period of time, we've lived in denial about climate change, even though we signed treaties and signed declarations and all said how important climate change was. I think as time catches up with us and as the years go by, and as we do not succeed in actually reducing emissions, but still see emissions climbing, we can see more readily the enormous impact it's having on the global economy, on global societies. And again, climate change is revealing. It's revealing in the same ways. It's revealing inequality. It's revealing how some countries and places and continents are impacted more heavily than others. It's also one of these ongoing, it's not a short, sharp impact, although the impact of a forest fire or the impact of a flood is indeed that. But the overall long-term impact is extremely grave, and it's having a profound effect on the health of global society. So if we only had those two things to worry about, you'd say, well, that's enough to be getting on with in terms of multilateralism. But think of some other really critical ones. The third one is one that a university audience will be very familiar with, and that is the transformation of technologies. How the digital revolution has created great opportunities. It's also created serious issues, but above all, it's made us realize the global nature of these issues, the global nature of this technology, which crosses borders and boundaries and frontiers and makes things available that were never available before. It also, because of the differential impact of it and because of its connection to this underlying issue of global inequality, some countries have far more access to the digital technologies than others do. And so we have an increasing something called the digital divide, which really means that there are many people that are left behind and are being driven even further behind by the nature of this digital divide. The fourth, I think, significant reality of our time is that despite what was a hope that the end of the Second World War would teach us some lessons about conflict and make us far smarter about not getting into conflicts, the reality is we are in the middle of some very deeply disturbing and troubling conflicts in the world today, and conflict prevention, conflict resolution was really at the heart of the formation of the United Nations, of the Charter, of all of the efforts that were made after 1945 to create a whole series of institutions that would prevent conflict and that would actually make the world a more peaceful place. The world has had periods of time in which it's been more peaceful than others, but we are really re-entering into a period where there's quite significant conflict and disruption. And I think it's fair to say even greater potential for serious conflict and violence at a scale that we have not really experienced since 1945. And I'll be talking about a couple of those in perhaps an answer to particular questions. And the last, I guess, thing that I would say reinforces the need for multilateralism is this issue of the shift in production and the shift in growth and the shift in power from Europe and North America to Asia, which is another global reality that happens. The centers of economic growth ever since economic growth started happening have always shifted. Empires have risen and fallen, and there are different centers of critical economic and social activity, and then there are periods in which there's a dramatic shift from one part of the world to the other in terms of where the major forces of change are taking place. There's little doubt that since 1980 in particular, and 1980 is the key date because it's the date at which Deng Xiaoping became the head of the Communist Party of China and effectively in charge of that country. We've seen a tremendous transformation driven by the changes in China, but now coupled with other changes that we're seeing in a number of other Asian countries, but none of them as significant as China itself. And I don't refer to it as the rise of China, but the return of China, because China was for many centuries a significant global power, and its power was eclipsed in the years between 1850 and 1980. But I think we're now seeing a return. And this return poses important questions, challenges that require a multilateral response. It's not adequate to think that people say, well, what's Canada going to do about China? The reality is Canada can only do so much on its own. We're a country of less than 40 million people. We are members of the G7 and the G20 and virtually every other club you can imagine, but we're still not a global power in the way in which China and the United States and some others clearly are. So The thing that brings these things together is the fact that they are global phenomena. They are not geographically limited in their impact. They do not have a limitation of that kind, and they can't simply be faced up to or resolved by bilateral diplomacy. We can't solve climate change by bilateral diplomacy. We can't deal with COVID either nationally or bilaterally. We might like to think that we can, but we can't. And the reality is it requires a broader and greater investment globally than we've ever seen before. The pressures on Canada to engage financially, to engage in terms of foreign assistance and aid, to look at what security preparations are we making for the changes that are taking place. There is no solution that does not require additional resources in order for Canada to play the kind of role that we need to play, and frankly, in order to respond to the nature of the crises that we're facing. So the first thing, therefore, is are we prepared to come out of our shell a bit? And I talked about COVID's impact, that it's a global phenomenon. But the other impact of COVID has been that it's made us each one of us more isolated from each other, but it's also made us look to our national governments to respond. We require of our national government that they respond to our needs on COVID. We require, when there's a major crisis in terms of flooding or drought or whatever it may be because of climate change, we want our national governments to respond. But beyond that, we also have to recognize that actually our national governments can respond, but can't prevent entirely on their own. We can respond effectively to crises with our national, local, provincial governments, but it actually requires a more global approach for it to have real impact. And there, I think the question for Canada is, how can we help to strengthen the global architecture that we helped to build after 1945? All the steps that we've taken to build international organizations, to build treaties, to build principles of law, to build the institutions that will help to enforce that law, although that's a weak point of the global system, as we know. All of those things, Canada has played a role in. Canada has always been party to them, and has been as constructive a partner in them as we can be. And again, we're going to have to continue. We're going to have to decide: do we want to continue to do that? Are we going to think of what are the next frontiers in terms of international organization and international engagement? So these are things that we need to be thinking through carefully. They're things we need to be debating in Parliament. And regrettably, I think we don't really debate these issues as seriously as we should. And we need to think more about how we can successfully engage. My short answer to the question is engagement is got to be the key word. And engagement requires of us a greater national effort than we've been willing to make at many key points in the last 20 or 30 years. We need to decide, I think, domestically, how much we are going to really invest in the challenges that the globe poses now to all of us in terms of the stability of the order that we've been trying to create since 1945. So I think I'll stop there. I wanted to leave as good a time for questions as I could. Kept, I think, almost within my time frame, but look forward to hearing any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for these remarks. I have two questions that I'll try to combine into one, which are broadly about the role of the UN and the role of Canada, right? So the first question is, what is happening with so even if you see the need for multilateralism, the legitimacy and efficacy of a UN system is being increasingly questioned. There's disengagement of the United States. The Security Council doesn't really work that well. And we're seeing, for example, you've mentioned the issue of global vaccines being a real issue of inequity, despite the calls from the WHO to share them, right? So, and then we have, commitments that are fairly weak when it comes to climate change. So how do you see the UN responding to these challenges? And there was a question also related to Canada's role in this, which is that Canada, as a middle power, has traditionally sided with the United States in particular, but as the US is retreating, and we've seen this in Afghanistan, for example, or the Middle East, then what can Canada do? So these are two questions. I mean, they're both, I'm sure, complex, and you've heard them before. So how do you see the UN's role going forward, and then Canada's place in the world?
Well, the first thing is to say there are no perfect offerings, Teddy. The UN is not perfect. It's a very, very human, and it has all the imperfections and fragilities and frailties of everything that human beings create. It's imperfect. The second is, I think, just to reinforce the point that the United Nations is not an it. Okay, it's an us. We are part of the United Nations. The United Nations is not always united. The member states of the world make up the United Nations, and we've created an organization which is only as effective as we allow it to be. If we decide that it's not going to be effective, it won't be effective. If we decide the Paris Treaty won't be effective, the Paris Treaty won't be effective. And we sometimes objectify, it's almost like a kind of a epistemological mistake. We objectify the institution and say, that's the problem, it's failing. Well, no, actually, look in the mirror. We're the ones who are failing. If we don't have a good global vaccine policy, it's because many countries have decided that this is how it's going to work. And there is no global government that has the power of enforcement. That's not what the UN is. We didn't create that in 1945. It was not on the agenda. And frankly, we need to understand this. We need to understand that there are, of course, institutional aspects of the UN, how the UN as an organization functions. But the budget of the UN as an organization is $3 billion. Okay? It's less than Metropolitan Toronto. That's the Secretariat's budget. Now, there's all the other agencies, there's all the other stuff that goes on and is part of the global architecture. Peacekeeping is a much greater number than that, and all the other institutions are far, far greater than that. But I mention that because I just think it's a misnomer to say these failures are the failures of this institution, of this thing that isn't somehow different from us. That's the wrong way to look at it. And it's a consistent problem with how people describe it. And how people describe the dynamics that are happening in the world. Your second question is a slightly different one, but a very important one. And yes, it's true. We are a North American country. Geographically, this is who we are. And we are right next door to a neighbor who's 10 times bigger than we are, and whose economy is much more powerful than ours, and whose military arsenal is the biggest in the world. And we have, over a period of many, many years, many decades, we have tied ourselves to and linked ourselves to that country and to that economy. And that's something we have to, as Canadians, we have to think about, well, what can we do to create a greater degree of autonomy for ourselves, if that's what we decide that we want to do. But we need to understand that anything we do will have consequences. We're at the moment in the United States, all of our consuls generals our Minister of Trade is in Washington today because the Americans are looking at legislation that would say to car companies, if you base your factories in the United States, we will give consumers a benefit if it's an electric car. But if the electric cars come from Germany or come from Canada, as it's currently worded, this is the proposal, then we won't give the benefit to consumers. Well, of course, companies are going to say, well, this is a huge car market. We can't not locate here. So too bad, Canada. Your electric car industry is not going to have much life, and that's a serious economic problem for Canada. So we need to understand where we are and who we are and how much freedom and flexibility we have to say and do what we want to do. My own view is we have more flexibility than we think, and we also have a responsibility to reflect on the values and principles that have been really critically important for us. I think the United States approach under President Trump was bad for the world, and I think it was certainly bad for global institutions, and I think, frankly, it was bad for Canada. I think that we also need to understand that part of what Trumpism was responding to and part of what it represents is still very much alive and present in American politics, and we need to understand that has consequences for us.
So there are two questions also about conflicts, which you've mentioned as one of the key issues in your remarks. So I guess the framing of these questions is the fact that they've become extremely divisive, as you've said, but multilateral policies have not really been successful in trying to address them. And there's a reference to the UN Security Council, which I mentioned before, the EU as well. So if you look at conflicts, I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian one being one core conflict that has been going on for very long, or even the conflict in either Ukraine or the South China Sea, how do you see Canada's role? Can it play a stronger role at the multilateral level than it is in trying to address some of those?
Well, first, let's talk about, each of the conflict. Every conflict is different, but also many of the elements of conflict are the same. I would add to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East, I would add to it the conflict with Iran, which adds a whole new dimension to the nature of the conflict. And the conflict, the Sunni-Shia conflict, which also plays between what's been going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the impact that various actors that are essentially controlled by Iran, or certainly heavily influenced by Iran, are subsidized and militarized by Iran, have on the Middle Eastern conflict as we define. So I don't think to describe it as simply Israel-Palestine, I think is too simplistic. It's much more complex than that. And again, the UN itself, the world has not been able to bring about a truly stable reconciliation in the Middle East that will create stability and human rights and democracy for all the parties and partners that are in the Middle East. That has not happened yet. But and that's where I think, how can Canada play a role? Well, I think Canada can play a very constructive role together with a number of other countries in looking at what needs to happen in order for us to get to an overall resolution of the conflict. And we should be very clear in I think Canada needs to continue to be very clear in saying one of the principles that was established after 1945, after the British decided to abandon the mandate, was that there had to be two states. And we've gone through different periods of time when you know, this notion was in abeyance, or people said, no, we don't want to go there, and it's been rejected by you know, by various parties on both sides in terms of looking at that as a solution. But I having been a student of the Middle East conflict for much of my life, I don't see another workable solution or a solution as good as that that would have as much foundation in reality. And I think Canada should continue to be working hard on that in all of its engagements with all sides of the conflict. I think the way in which Iran has fueled extremism in the region is extremely dangerous. And when I talked about the potential for even more serious conflict, I think we have to understand what's at stake in the current negotiations and discussions around nuclear proliferation as it relates directly to Iran. I do believe that a failure there will create another series of really big challenges to face up to. I think Canada should be in a position where we can talk to all sides, even if we don't agree with all sides. I think we need to be in a position where we can speak discreetly where we have to, but also candidly with countries. And this is a difficult balance to find. We spoke candidly about human rights violations in Saudi Arabia through Twitter, and our ambassador was expelled. And you know that we should figure out a way to carry on our diplomacy while staying engaged. The Americans, the Brits, the Germans, many other countries have gone through periods when there's been you know, a row of one kind or another, but we shouldn't let that get in the way of being able to really seriously engage on all sides of the equation. I think it's not, none of these conflicts are easy. I think that the South China Sea, the question of the security of Taiwan, and is extremely difficult for the world and for all of us. There has to be some recognition that the growth of democracy in Taiwan and the growth of the Taiwanese economy is a remarkable human achievement. And I really believe that its demise would be a terrible thing for democracy, terrible thing for the people who are living in Taiwan, and is something that we should be doing everything we can to discourage the Chinese from exploring various ways in which they might try to destabilize the situation in the South China Sea. But I think we engage with China. We have an ambassador in Beijing who speaks to the Chinese regularly about our views and what we think. But the other thing I believe is that our power is enhanced, our influence is enhanced when we work effectively with others. We do that here at the UN. We work with others. That's how we are more effective. We're not effective if we just stand up and say, this is what I think, and then sit down and say goodbye. That doesn't have much impact. After you might make you feel good for a while, but the reality is you want your political interventions to be consequential, and you want what you do to be consequential, and I think that's something we need to continue to think about as we talk about our diplomacy.
There's a number of questions on Canadian foreign policy, which I will get to in a minute, but I just want to build on what you just said and ask you a couple of perhaps more precise questions about conflicts, in particular the role of the UN in peacekeeping, conflict prevention, and mediation. There's a question about the UN's failed call for a COVID ceasefire, and whether you see this as meaning that the UN's ability towards peacekeeping, conflict prevention, etc., is in decline, or perhaps even unwelcome. And I guess the Canadian part to this question is whether you see Canada's role in conflict prevention as also having declined in recent years. For example, the deployment of peacekeepers or more civilian support for UN peace operations. Can Canada play a bigger role in these global narratives as we used to do? And here I'm quoting from the question directly, like we used to be with a human security agenda.
To be very blunt, I really think that we are doing more on conflict prevention globally than most people understand and believe. You talk about the South China Sea. Canada is involved and engaged there. We are trying to prevent a conflict by joining with others in making it clear that we're there. We're doing the same thing with respect to the enforcement of UN sanctions on North Korea. Our Navy is directly involved. We are have our troops are in Latvia. Why are they there? They're there to provide us, send a clear message to the Russians that NATO is not abandoning its eastern frontier. Now, these are not, people I think have a somewhat delusional, that's too strong a word. I think peacekeeping in many parts of the world where there are peacekeepers, UN missions, are conflict. They're embedded in conflict. They're not necessarily preventing conflict. We are engaging in direct engagement with extremist forces of one kind or another that are disrupting a variety of societies. So I think when it comes to the broader range of things that we're doing in conflict prevention, we're founding part of the Peace Building Commission, which is a very significant, innovative institution that the UN has created. We are major funders of that. We have developed the ELSI initiative on looking at ways in which women can play a stronger role in peace building and in peacekeeping. And I think in what we're trying to encourage the United Nations to do is to look at more beefed up work on conflict prevention and more effective intervention early intervention in order to avoid more serious conflict. And that is something we're not only committed to doing or talking about, we're actually doing it. We're actually funding it, and we have Canadians who are engaging in it. And I think that's where we need to understand how in effect the world is changing, and the nature of peacekeeping and peacekeeping operations and peace building operations is changing. But the idea that somehow Canada is not engaged in that process is simply not true. With respect to calling for the ceasefire, I think the Secretary General will always take an opportunity to say, why not have a ceasefire? Because killing people is destructive. And I think in COVID, he saw that it'd even be more destructive. It had some regional impact. There were some disputes which were less violent for a period of time. But I come back to the first point that I was making that I haven't seemed to have landed yet, and that is that the UN has no power to enforce a ceasefire by itself. The Secretary General has to spend a lot of time persuading people to do things which he believes need to be done. He doesn't have an army at his disposal. It was actually Churchill who, in a speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1945, suggested that the UN itself needed a rapid force. I think there's a very strong case to be made for that, but I can assure you that there are forces at work in the Security Council who would have nothing to do with that, because they would not want to give to the Secretary General or to the Secretariat of the United Nations the ability to intervene quickly, unilaterally, decisively, in order to prevent an even worse conflict from happening. They would say, no, that has to be done by the Security Council. And we all know what that means. Something the Russians and Chinese would say, no, that's not going to happen. And so it's challenging, yeah, but that's why I say when I look at what Canada is doing multilaterally, it's not just what we do through the UN. Because frankly, if we do have other alliances and other ways in which we engage, the purpose of which is purpose of our NATO alliance is not to make war. The purpose of our NATO alliance is to prevent war. And the purpose of our interventions in Asia are not to create war, they're to prevent a war from happening, with all of the consequences that such a conflict would have.
So we have two questions again that I'm going to try to combine together, which are essentially about Canada's foreign policy. One is about how you see Canada's feminist foreign policy with your outlook. How does it fit with your outlook on multilateralism? And then the second question is about, critiques of Canadian foreign policy or a lack thereof, and how can we reinvigorate discussions and approaches in Canada towards a more robust foreign policy? Sorry.
The feminist foreign policy is deeply integrated and embedded in everything that we do here in New York and what we do in Geneva, what we do in other parts of the world, and I'm very, very proud to be part of a country that has such a policy, but also recognizing that there are many other countries that do as well. I'm about to go from here. I'm going to go to a meeting, been called by our Dutch friends to talk further on these 16 days of action on gender-based violence and on the impact that that's having on the world, to talk with other countries who also have a feminist foreign policy as part of their sort of official approach to things, to go forward. So it has an impact on everything, and we've been talked a bit about it, about the ELSI initiative, about bringing that perspective into our work on peace building and peacekeeping. I think it's critically important that be the case, just as we've seen our own military going through a process of transformation, sometimes difficult. We need to recognize the importance of building this understanding into everything that we do, including our assistance programs, our approach to human rights, the work that we do with civil society groups in countries all around the world, affecting hundreds of millions of people. This is the fundamental principle of the equality between women and men, and the importance for us to name patriarchy for what it is, as a particular form of oppression, and as the creator of an enormous injustice historically in the world. And that until we talk as candidly and directly about that, not just as a quote, one of many human rights issues, but as a centrally offensive human rights fact for the world, and it affects how we engage with a number of countries. It makes our relationships with those countries more tense, because we are a country that says, what are you doing here? Why would we? How can we live in the 21st century without recognizing this fundamental equality? It's driving part of the debate around what can we do with respect to Afghanistan, among other countries. So yeah, it's a foundational principle for us, and I think it's exceptionally important.
I see too.
The other half of the question was,
what was I? I think I had asked you about. Gosh, I think it was about how can we reinvigorate discussions about a more robust.
I mean, I think that is a challenge, because I recognize, first of all, we do have a foreign policy. The things that I'm talking about today are not invented by me and just, on the spur of the moment. They're foundational principles of how to go forward in the world. I think that part of the challenge that we face in this moment, in this particular moment, is how to really engage Canadian civil society in this broader discussion how do we engage in the world? Sometimes people who disagree with a foreign policy will say, you don't have a foreign policy. And you sort of say, yes, we do, but you actually don't agree with it. So you rather than name it in that way, you sort of say that's a reality. So I think we have to really come to grips with what's already happening, and that is the need to continue to engage with the Canadians about why these issues are important and how they can be framed effectively and how they can be communicated more effectively. And I think this is something that, you know, in Ottawa, people are thinking about. Certainly, we think about it in New York and in other capitals. We're always trying to figure out ways of communicating more effectively, which is one of the reasons why I'm talking to you today, is because I don't think we can't get enough of this conversation, and we need to provide more. But this is part of a broader problem. We don't have enough journalists who are reporting on foreign conflict. We don't have enough media who are reporting on it around the world. Canada used to have, you know, reporters in different places, established institutions that did them. So the media world has changed and transformed. We can't go back to the way things were in 1952 or 1973. We have to recognize that all institutions are changing and are impacted by it. But that means we have to respond accordingly. We have to engage much more effectively in communicating and in talking and debating with Canadians about what we're doing, which is why I do what I do.
I'll ask you a couple of more specific questions now, but I'll ask one at a time. Can you conceive of a plausible circumstance in which Canada would withdraw from a multilateral institution? And the follow-up is it always in our interest to participate in a multilateral institution or initiative?
Those are awfully hypothetical questions. I mean, I mean, the answer is, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, can we conceive of it, you know, and are there things but I think we've made, where we've retreated, for example, the former government decided to get out of the decertification, the issue of what's happening in Africa to the African climate. And we got out of that, said that's not important to us, not a big priority. So to say, well, actually, it's damned important because it affects the security of an entire region of the globe, in which we have a vital interest as a member of the global community. So I'm delighted that we said, no, well, now we're actually back at that table. I think it's important for us to recognize that the words multilateral are cover a variety of things and a variety of ways of doing things. And I think we have to be much more, careful about how we describe certain things. That's what I always make the point now, where people say, well, the only form of peacekeeping or conflict prevention is what happens through the United Nations. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that's a misnomer. The UN is a good part of what we do, but it's not the only part, and it's not the only place, because there are a whole variety of other places where we do, and frankly, because of the, just like the Garden of Eden was featured original sin, the UN Charter featured the original sin of the veto, and that's what creates the problem. There are those who say we can only go into missions which are supported by the Security Council. Well, that means we'll only go into missions that are supported by China, Russia, France, Britain, and the United Kingdom and the US. And you say, look, how can you let your capacity to intervene be limited by that notion? And I think we have to be very candid about that. As I said, this is an imperfect institution. It's an important institution, and it's one that's doing vital work in many parts of the globe. But that it isn't our notion of what we do is not limited to that. And that's frankly why we joined NATO in 1949. It's why we do a whole bunch of other things that we've done, the range of institutions that we've joined, the Commonwealth, Francophonie, OAS, you name it, we're part of it. And, that's who we are.
There's a specific question about China and its desire to strengthen its position in multilateral organizations. in particular by relying on developing countries to do that. Is a powerful China in these organizations, do you see that as a good thing for the future of multilateralism?
I think it depends on, frankly, I think it depends on how China decides to do it and how we all decide to react to it. Chinese officials who work in the United Nations do not work for the government of China. Canadian officials who work in the UN do not work for me. They don't report to me. They don't report to Minister Joly. We don't, they work for the UN. And Chinese officials who work in the UN work for the UN, and they don't work for the government of China. Having said that, I don't think we should demonize the fact that a great, huge country, which is now returning to a place of significance in the world. I don't think we should demonize the fact that they say, well, we should have some officials at the UN that respond to us. The problem that I think we have is that China is a dictatorship, and its officials are not renowned for their ability to express their own point of view. It's not like Canada, where, I mean, there are officials in Canada who will disagree with me, former ambassadors to the UN who will disagree with me publicly and say, why is he doing this? Why isn't he saying that? And that's a healthy thing. And I think that's the concern that any of us would have, that we don't want creeping authoritarianism to get into the language and work of the UN. We want the UN to be a place where the rule of law and where pluralism and where differing points of view are respected. And that's something that's a concern to Canada, and a concern to me. But it doesn't mean that I think that China's isn't going to play a critical role. We're not going to resolve the climate change issue unless China is thoroughly engaged. We need to understand that there are lots of issues we cannot resolve without China's presence and participation. And so our relationship with China is complex. And if we make it too simplistic, it won't work for us. It won't work for the world, and it won't have any impact.
I think you've partly addressed one question about increased Canadian engagement in the UN, but there's a question about sort of the specifics of that. So, how do we do this? So, for example, could it be about having more Canadians head UN agencies or more funding? I think the funding issue comes up all the time, right? About more funding for voluntary UN funds, etc. Do you have some ideas about how we can get Canadians more engaged with the UN?
Well, first of all, we are, per capita, I don't want this to become a headline, but per capita, we are not underrepresented at senior positions in the UN. We are not. We are well represented. We have two undersecretary generals at the moment. We have many others who are working in senior positions and a whole variety of agencies across the board. And that's a fact. And I would be very supportive if we were to return to supporting a program where we encouraged younger Canadians to get into the UN. We have a junior officer program that was abandoned several years ago, and I think that was a mistake. I'd love to get that back on the books as something that we will do as a government to get us engaged at that level. And so I think that's important. We've been we're in the top 10 consistently of funders of the United Nations. We're a significant contributor in that sense. We pay our dues in the month of January, which very few other countries do, which is when they fall due. And we respond to significant requests for assistance. Where I think we need to continue to understand where global needs are, and this, I guess I'm making a pitch to my colleagues in the Department of Finance. We need to understand that the costs of dealing with the crises that I've described, the cost of dealing with COVID, the cost of dealing with climate change, the cost of dealing with conflict, and the cost of dealing with poverty globally are not going down, they're going up. The UN just announced today for the humanitarian assistance a 17% increase. And some people might say, oh my God, 17% increase, what are they thinking? And you say, I'll tell you what they're thinking. They're thinking that that's what they need. That's what's happened to the world. That we have more refugees. We have more than 17% more refugees. We have more than 17% more challenges as a result of COVID. So those costs are going to go up. If we make the mistake that some countries have made, and that frankly we have made in the past, of saying, well, we've got a budgetary issue now, we've got to cut back on what we do on foreign policy and foreign assistance because there are no voters for the government living in X or Y country, so it's easy, it's painless, nobody will notice. I'm sorry, everyone is noticing, and the problems are bigger, and it would be an act of serious mistake. As Talleyrand once said of something, he said, it's worse than immoral, it's a mistake. It would be a mistake for Canada to do less, and it is a requirement that we do more. The Secretary General has said that solidarity is necessity, and I agree with him 100%. I couldn't have said it better myself. Solidarity is the most important value of our time because what we are facing is a threat to our common existence. And so if we come up with responses that are less than solidaristic, we're failing not only ourselves, but we're certainly failing future generations who will pay a very heavy price for our failure.
So maybe one final question, because it's almost 1 o'clock. It's more sort of an aspirational question. So if there is a change that you would like to see at the UN, what would it be?
Well, there's changes you want to see, and there's changes that are, what's realistic. I mean, I think if the organization could become less bureaucratic, less hierarchical, less working in silos, if there could be fewer speeches and more candor in the public kind of forum of the UN, I think that'd all be terrific. And that's actually something that's doable. These things could be done. The reform of the Security Council, which is something I think needs to happen, is, again, it's the veto that gets in the way. Countries are not likely to agree to a change that will diminish their veto power. They created a structure in 1945 that gave them this extraordinary power as a result of what happened in World War II, and they're not about to give it up. And I think that in the absence of that, to create more vetoes is frankly problematic. But we need a bigger Security Council, and it needs to work differently and more effectively with the General Assembly, more effectively with other institutions. And the last one I would say is the Economic and Social Council is sort of like a slumbering giant. It's one of the major bodies of the United Nations. It's set out in the Charter, but it has not been at the focal point of a lot of debates around the global economy that I think it should be. And it needs the administrative support and the political support to do that. So those are a few items, not just one.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray, for making the time today to share your insights about very complex issues and for also answering all of these questions. There were many more, but I'm sure we'll have a chance perhaps one day to connect again and continue this conversation. I've personally enjoyed this event and enjoyed meeting you. And I also want to thank all the attendees, and I wish everyone a pleasant afternoon. So thank you again for the time.
Eddie, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And it's good to see friends. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to your students. And I appreciate very much your marshaling the questions. So hope I didn't wander too far afield, but thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.